So how did that go? A little scary when you start cutting, but again, it's a sliver trim. It doesn't require a lot of fabric being removed. Now, the next step we need to do is we need to draw a 1/4 inch marking on all 4 corners. So I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to place the 1/4 inch line on my ruler on the edge of my quilt top. I'm going to draw a line that way, and then I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other end. Okay, so you're going to go and you're going to do that to all 4 corners, and you can see that I've got all of my 4 corners marked. Your next step will be to fold your quilt in half and find the center of your top and your bottom and of your 2 sides. You can see now I have the center of my top of my quilt marked, and I actually have the center of my top border marked. And now I'm going to line up those 2 centers, and working from the middle, I am going to pin all the way across. And this is really important. So you want to pin and pin. So I'm going to continue pinning. And when I get to the end, I am going to stop where that line is that I've drawn. So this line actually represents your seam line. And that's really important to know, so that when we go to do the mitered corners, we need to allow for that seam allowance. So let me finish pinning, and I'm going to take this to the machine, and then I'm going to come back and show you what the next step is. I have my border now pinned on, my top border pinned on. So just to review, I found the center of my top border. I found the center of the top part of my quilt, lined up my centers, working from the middle, I pinned all the way out to both corners. Now when I got to the corners, I marked a pin where that 1/4 inch seam allowance was that we drew on our quilt. And then I just transferred that mark with another marker. Now I'm going to take this to my sewing machine, and I am going to start stitching right where that line is. I'm going to do a little back stitch, so 2 or 3 stitches forward, 2 or 3 stitches backwards, and then I'm going to go all the way across until I get to the other 1/4 inch mark. So there's the marking that I made on my quilt, and I've just transferred that mark onto my border. And when I get to that point, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to back up, do a little locking stitch or a back stitch and a forward stitch. So I'm going to get that done, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to show you how to put the next border on. All right, now have my top border sewn on, and I just want to re-emphasize how important it is to stop and start at that line that we've marked. And you can see a little better now when I pull that back. You can see there's my 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I can't emphasize this enough. It's not an approximate 1/4 inch or just about a 1/4 inch, or I think it's a 1/4 inch. Measure it and be sure. I see way too many people cheating, and then they have a great big hole in their quilt, and we don't want that. So, and again, I did just do a little tiny back stitch to secure that, because there will be a little bit of stress. And then on this corner, I did the exact same thing. And I don't know if it shows up, but when I did the back stitching here, I kind of got a little carried away, and I got 1 extra little stitch in there, and that will cause puckering. So what I'm going to do is take my seam ripper and just break that 1 little stitch. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to put the other 3 borders on, again, matching the centers of my border strip sets to the centers of my quilt and pinning from the center outwards. Always remembering to mark that 1/4 inch. So when I've done that and I've pressed, I will be back to show you the secret to putting perfect mitered corners on. Well, I've got all 4 borders sewn on. I have made sure I've got my seams pressed. So my side seams I have pressed going towards the quilt. my top and bottom seams are going away. That is so that our borders will nest together. Now, one thing I would like to just point out before, because I know you guys are watching the video and then going, when you go to put your borders on, make sure that your first border is always against your quilt. I've seen it way too many times where people get a little bit ahead of themselves and they turn their border strips around and they get the outside border pinned to the inside of the quilt. So just a little word of warning. All right, so I've got my quilt laid out, and now it's time to do the magic. I'm going to take my quilt. You can see I've got it laid out really nice, and I'm going to pull this end up, and I'm going to line up, and hopefully Joanne can get in here. I'm going to line up my top border, my two outside borders. You can see how I've got them lined up, and everything is just laying nice and flat. And then I'm going to sort of feel, because I've got my seams pressed the alternate direction, they're going to nest in, and you're going to feel for that nesting. If they don't nest in, you're going to get a big lump, or if there's a gap, you will feel that gap. So I've got mine all nested in really nice and tight. And I'm now going to take my ruler, and everybody has a ruler that has a 45-degree line on it. I'm going to take that 45-degree line, and I'm going to lay it so that it's on top of the outside border, and I'm going to just shift that ruler down, maintaining my 45, and I want my ruler to intersect right here where I started and stopped my stitching. So I'm just going to move my ruler back into place. And now with my marker, I'm simply going to draw my stitching line. I will be stitching on this line. There's not a 1/4 inch. I'm stitching on that line. Now the next thing I want to do is I'm going to pin crosswise so that my seams stay nested into one another. And the last thing you want to do is you want to make sure that your bottom and your top seams are pulled away from your border strips so that you don't inadvertently stitch one of those down. All right, I'm going to go to my machine, I'm going to sew, and I'm going to come back and see and show you the result. I'm here at the sewing machine, and I wanted to just basically show you that I'm going to start in the center, and I'm going to be stitching on the line. And as I get started, I want to do a couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches backwards, being careful not to stitch into the seam allowance that I sewed previously for the borders. And then I'm just going to feel with my hand, making sure that my seams stay nested into one another, and everything feels great, and I'm just going to continue on. So you can go ahead and do that now, and at the end we'll come back and we'll press all of those seams open and marvel at what a beautiful job we've done. I have completed sewing all 4 corners now, and the next step here is to press these seams all open. So I'm simply going to open them up, give them a little shot of seam, and you're going to find you have like a little dog ear here in the corner, and it's going to want to just sort of lay into that mitered corner that you've made. Once you have your seam pressed open, when we turn it over, you're going to see beautiful, beautiful matching corners. And here's where I want to tell you, if by chance you get a little pucker in this corner, it generally means that you've got 1, maybe 2 stitches a little bit too close to this seam line or this seam line, and all you have to do is go with your seam ripper and just undo those 2 stitches. After I have all 4 corners pressed and I'm pleased, then you're going to go and you're going to be very, and I have to stress, very, very careful, and you're going to trim off the excess. I like to use a 1/2 inch as opposed to a 1/4, just to be careful. Alrighty, so that concludes your mitered corners on your mystery quilt. I will be coming back in the next series of videos giving you some tips and hints on how you can quilt this yourself. If you are an embroidery machine owner, then I'm going to show you how you can use your embroidery machine to quilt this quilt. This is Jackie from the Myra Stitch and Post. Thank you for participating in our mystery quilt. This is not the end, but I'm sure you're all going to be very pleased with your mitered corners.